Hey everyone, Samy from Ketchapp here. Very happy to be with you today. I'm in charge of the business development and market intelligence questions at Ketchapp, and I'm here today to show you the first part of an analysis of the 3Cs in Hypercasual that we've been working on. And today we'll focus on the controls and we'll see how they can impact the depth potential of your game. And before we start, I want to clarify a few things. First, a controller is not good or bad by nature. What really matters is that your controller and your game concept are aligned. And I really want to insist on it. The most important thing you want to make sure is that the controller you choose is the most relevant one to bring your idea to life. That being said, some controllers tend to offer more freedom to the players than others by nature. For example, tap timing controls usually offer quite binary experiences. You tap or you don't, while drawing or joystick usually offer more space for the player's creativity. And this is basically the definition of depth in video games. When your players are free to choose their in-game approach when they face a specific situation, your game is deep. And why does it matter? Well, because depth is probably the best way to engage players on the long run without creating endless content. And that makes from depth one of the keys to success in hypercasual in the future. Now, what you see on screen here is mostly an oversimplified segmentation of the market, and the point of this presentation will be to go beyond this understanding because a great tap timing game can be deeper than a bad drawing one, for example. So in the rest of this presentation, we'll review the different nuances of depth that can be offered by each specific control depending on factors like design, game design, or secondary mechanics. And let's start with the tap timing controller, very straight to the point. Everything's in the name here. The goal is to tap on time to get rewarded. And our game stack here is a quite old but still relevant example of tap timing game done right. The controls are really easy to get. The flow of the game, once you've mastered the controls, can become very satisfying and visually rewarding. There's plenty of visual feedback to make perfect action even more satisfying. Perfect combos are rewarded, as you can see in this video. They allow you to grow back the pieces of the tower that you've lost previously. But let's face it, Stack is far from being our most forgiving title, as it belonged to this first generation of hyper-casual game when they were way more challenging than they are today. And the tap timing action can become quite repetitive in general. So one advice here for tap timing games to break this kind of repetitive feeling, always try to escape the natural binarity of the controller. Don't just go perfect or fail. Try to implement different nuances of timing like perfect, very good, good, okay, bad, and for each of them have a different in-game impact. This allows to make the game both more forgiving and more interesting to play. And as you will see on next slide, this is used in most of the successful tap timing games. And here you have four examples of great tap timing implementation from the not so deep one to the very deep one. Now let me be clear, there's not one bad game on this slide and three good ones, and all these games have been extremely successful ones, so the idea is more to give you an overview of what's possible with one type of controller. And as you can see here, there are plenty of ways to make great tap timing games. It can be by working on super spectacular visual rewards like in Slap Kings and its hilarious animations, with a special mention to the stat system used to break the binarity we mentioned previously. Or it can be done by implementing a risk-reward mechanic like in Hand Guillotine, where you have to tap as many times as possible in a row without getting your hand chopped. You can also add a lot of depth and variety through level design with different weapons, with different behaviors, with different enemies, like in Johnny Trigger. And you can go even deeper with games like Knife Hit, for example, where each tap influences the next one. Once you've thrown one knife in Knife Hit, the target evolves, and you'll have to be careful not to shoot at the same spot after. Then you have the swipe, which is by nature really dynamic and a super cool way to interact with games, especially since it's quite intuitive and addictive because it's an interaction which is almost mainstream now thanks to social medias like TikTok, Instagram, or dating apps like Tinder, for example. But the main challenge in game will be on the precision side. Like, how do you allow players to swipe quickly while remaining in full control of the situation? And here again, there are different ways to do so. You can go for the Tinder style, swipe right to approve, left to reject. Very simple but quite binary design, like in Guilty, for example. You can restrain the possible moves to up, down, and left, right swipes, like in all these amazing maze games like Stacky Dash, Amaze, Roller Splat, House Paint. And you can go one step further to give even more freedom to your players by adding the diagonals axis, like in Swipe Fight, where you can kick your enemies in 7 different directions and dodge with when you swipe down. Of course, increasing the numbers of axes is not the only way to add depth to swipe games. And for example, you could also add different layers of depth by adding secondary mechanics, for example, to the maze games we mentioned, with mechanics such as resource collection or enemies execution, for example. Then we have the tap and hold controller, which is amazing to introduce risk-reward mechanics. As you can see in Rush Hour 3D, the controls perfectly match the game's goal. You hold to accelerate and go to the left line, and you release to slow down and come back on the right one. And the whole pleasure of this game comes from that challenge. Can I try to overtake just one more car, or should I play it safe and slow down? And this game also perfectly highlights the challenge that comes with tap and hold, which is mainly to make sure that it's not too punitive and to make sure that you properly reward the players for the risks they've taken. Now here too, you can imagine plenty of different approaches for tap and hold. You could go very ASMR-ish with a contemplative experience and pretty low challenge, like in Popcorn Burst, where you just have to hold and release once per level. Or you could choose a more action-driven approach, like in Agent Action, where you hold to shoot and release to take cover. But you could also have different behaviors for the tap and hold depending on the in-game context to give more depth to your game. For example, in Rider, when you're on the floor and you hold, your bike accelerates, and when you're in the air, it flips. And it can go even further in this logic with games like Mr. Slice, for example, where you can both move, aim, slice just by holding your finger on screen, and it also has a very nice ASMR vibe, so a really cool one. Then comes the Swerve, this left to right slider that we used in Zombie Royale. It isn't exactly the deepest controller by nature, since you only let the freedom to the player to move on a 2D axis. But it's perfect to add a lot of secondary mechanics, and it suits deep runners extremely well. And you can go pure swerve like Skyroller to avoid the different obstacles on your way. You can add a layer of depth and risk reward like in Bike Rush, where you can hold to flip while your character is in the air. And you could go even deeper, like Voodoo did with Cassette and OHM on Aquapark de Tayo and Shortcut Run, where you have these very smart hacking mechanics and where at any moment the players can choose to go for a risky and exciting approach that will make them feel super smart. Then you have the tap and drag mechanic, which is usually used to move objects in most of the time light puzzle games, like here in Art Blitz, where you have to move the different parts of La Joconde to reveal it. The main issue with this controller can be the lack of visibility that can be implied by the continuously on-screen finger from the player. That's why this controller is mostly used in quite static puzzle games where there is no time constraints or reactivity constraint. And in puzzle game, it can be used like for continuous and simple actions, like in Master Cut, where you drag the shuriken to create nice haircuts. It can be used in more advanced puzzles like Origame or Tangle Master. You have to drag some elements and release them once they've reached the best position. And you can also use this tap and drag mechanic control in aim games. For example, in Ultimate Disc, where you have to anticipate the movements of your opponent and to anticipate the trajectory of your disc, it would like in these kind of cases where there's no direct threat to your characters, it works perfectly. Or you could use it in games like the physics-based Hitmasters, which is in between aim games and light puzzles, where you have to carefully aim at strategic elements from the settings to get rid of your enemies in the smartest possible way, meaning without using too many bullets. Then, and since we've just talked about aim games, when it comes to aiming, the most intuitive controller is probably the tap to aim. And what's amazing with this controller is that it's actually super versatile and it can be used in many different cases. For example, in puzzle games like Puzzle Blast right here, where you have to pick the different elements of the image you're supposed to highlight. With this controller, it's super important to make sure that your targets are easily visible and reachable. You don't want to have your players to complain or to be frustrated because they have two big fingers that hide what they're supposed to aim in the game. And here you could go for a different approach, of course. So you could go for uh, a sort of binary approach, like in choice-based games, where you have to pick an option A or an option B, like in Escape Jail. You could go for a bit richer choices, like in all these kind of pull the pin games that we've seen this year. Or you could go for the shooting games, and here you could go for shooting games with advanced interaction with the settings, for example, like we did in Groundbreaking, where you can destroy and break the arena into pieces to get rid of your enemies. Or you could go even deeper in aim games with smart secondary mechanics, like it's the case in Claw Hero, for example, where you can tap at your enemies to grab them with your grapple and tap again to send them away and use their body to hit the other enemies. Then comes the drawing games, which are quite interesting because they had their epic momentum last year as they allow the players to really express uh, pretty freely their creativity and thus to live a very personalized experience. This is, of course, only the theory, as most of the time, as games creators, we have to put some limitation to this creativity to avoid technical issues or game design issues. And so, in the end, we tend to restrain the freedom that this controller could offer. For example, like in this game with the drawing zone, which allows to make sure that the drawing are of a certain size and to keep the action readable. Now the drawing controller really stands out thanks to the huge range of ways it can be exploited for. You can go for an illustration approach where the players need to reproduce or create certain shapes as faithfully as possible, which is sometimes quite dangerous because it's difficult to be a good drawer on screen. You can go for what we call ephemeral drawing, where your drawing disappears as soon as you've created it, like for example in Fruit Ninja or Samurai Slash, where drawing could actually be seen almost as an evolution of swiping, but that would give more controls to the players. And you can go for games where you could draw to create path, mostly in physics-based puzzles, like Happy Glass, for example. And finally, you can go for the live creation approach that we've seen a lot this year with many super clever games where what you draw directly appears in-game and impacts your character's progression as he moves forwards. Scribble Rider is one of the many very successful games that have been released using this mechanic last year. And finally, we have the joystick that offers full freedom of movement to the character in a 3D space. This controller offers a huge playground and can be combined with many interesting gameplay mechanics, but you need to be careful, especially with the camera, to be far enough for the player to see clearly his environment and to allow him to anticipate the dangers that are coming to him, but also to be close enough to keep the game immersive and easily understandable. Because if you are too far, you can, well, not understand as well what's happening on screen. So one quite common practice here is to go for quite close camera, but to add indicators to help the player anticipate the obstacle or the enemies that would remain on screen, for example. And very important too, your level design and camera have to guide the user to show them the way. Basically, it's like Master Thief, the example that we have right here, is a great example of this. The camera is first locked on the object that you have to steal, and then wherever you are in the level, you always can clearly see the ending of the level, which is the helicopter that you have to use. Now, here more than anywhere else, maybe there's a huge variety of additional mechanics that can be added to the joystick controller, from the action at release that you can see in games like Desert Riders, for example, where you aim with the joystick and when you release, your car performs a dodge move. To the collect as you move, like in Snowball.io, which is extremely clever. You collect snow as you move and get slower as your snowball becomes bigger, which makes you an easier target to shoot for your opponents. But at the same time, the bigger is your snowball, the most satisfying the games get. So this is a super smart risk-reward mechanic. And finally, you can go for the even deeper approach of games like Wobbleman, where the joystick allows you to move freely, and when you stop next to different elements, you can interact with them, which allows you to have a huge variety of approaches to combine shooting, infiltration, puzzle mechanics, all these while keeping the game extremely simple to play. And now we talked about all the very classic controllers of hypercasual that cover 99% of the releases these days. But there's also another kind of controllers, the kind of weirdos club. Most of the time, the game using these tricks remain totally unseen. But if you're bold and lucky enough, standing out of the crowd thanks to this controller can actually pay, like it did with us for Scream Go Hero, this amazing voice activated game. Sorry. In case you missed it, the game became 2 years after its release amazingly viral thanks to some TikTok videos and also thanks to a bit later to a video from Jimmy Fallon, but that's another story. And after that, the game benefited from a huge organic downloads boost, but this remained a quite unique success story, of course. Among the very interesting other types of controllers, we can mention the ones that are based on new technologies, like the face recognition for Wacky Face or the accelerometer tilt back in the day with games for like Doodle Jump, for example. But you have also some very nice experiments like Type Run, where you play with your keyboard, or Prince of Persia Escape and its on-screen buttons. One thing which is very important here is that most of the time, the winner, which is the first player to reach the market, takes it all because once the wow effect of this new controller is gone, the controls are actually not really sustainable for more games to join the party. And now I can't finish this presentation without having a word about two trends that will continue to coexist in 2021 and that have already impacted 2020 in a very strong way. The first one is the multi-gameplay compilation trend. Its rise is mostly linked to the rise of simulation genre in 2020. You know, these very relaxing and mesmerizing games that offer super appealing CPIs, but also usually quite low retention. Well, to compensate this retention issue while still benefiting from the great acquisition costs of this kind of games, we've seen the multiplication of two formulas. The first one is what we call the multi-steps games that regroup in one game many different gameplays linked to a specific activities. For example, acrylic nail, where you have to first cut the nail, then polish it, and then paint it. And the second one is more what we could call a multi-game compilation with entirely different gameplays and themes based around one theme, like it's the case in Spamaster, for example. To us, this trend is a bit, let's say, artificial, as it mostly reuse and additioned already successful core gameplays, let's say, from previous successful games, and just kind of reskins it. And it's a bit less interesting that this second trend that we're about to mention, which is the sort of mix and match controls to create entirely new experiences. And this will be the conclusion of this presentation. This is probably the most promising and exciting trend that will allow hypercasual genre to renew itself in the upcoming month. It's so these kind of experiences where you consistently merge different gameplays together to have a very consistent gameplay experience. And we already have some extremely nice examples of what it could give in sort of AAA hyper-casual games like Force Master, for example, where you have the combination of joystick to move, swipe to shoot, and tap to grab your enemies. It was also amazingly done in Swing Loop, where you could swerve to move, swipe to jump, and tap and hold to swing, or in games even older like Flippy Race, for example, where you had to swerve to move and hold to flip. To us, this is really the way to deliver deeper and more engaging in-game experience in hyper-casual games, and we're really looking forward to playing and creating more games based on these controllers. And that's it for today, guys. This was the first part of our 3Cs presentation series. I hope you found it interesting, and do not hesitate to reach out to us if you want to learn more about the other presentation, or if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. See you guys.
Okay. So Simi, we're online already now. Let's continue with the Q&A session. We have a couple of questions now. I'll first of all, I want to say thank you with this approach to your speech, providing that unique and that useful deep content for all the listeners. This is something really, really unique. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Uh,
Appreciate it.
we have a couple of questions actually there. Um, okay, first of all, there was a question regarding accelerometer usage in hyper-casual games. Could you please comment on that?
Sure. Well, we mentioned it a bit in the presentation actually, but the point is to say that accelerometer are a part of this kind of very special controllers that we don't see a lot for a quite simple reason. It's because it's not that easy to play with accelerometer. As long as you go for the accelerometer, you bring some potential frustration for the players because it's not as precise as the interaction that you could have with your finger, with the more traditional controls. And it's also something that was trendy at some point back in the day when accelerometer just arrived in our mobile games, but that doesn't really work anymore. You know what we need to think first in hypercasual is the accessibility of your prototype. It must be playable in any conditions. So if you're in the subway with a lot of things moving around you, you don't want to have to play with the accelerometer of your game. You just want to interact simply with your phone. So yeah, on this side, we don't recommend to go in that direction and to stick to the more classic controls.
Thank you so much for the answer. But still, maybe you know some successful cases where accelerometer is used in the hypercasual games. Are there
Well,
any?
actually, not recent ones. Like the last time we saw a successful game based on accelerometer controls in mobile, I think was with the very old um, crap, I just forgot its name, but the Doodle Jump. Yeah, so quite a long time ago and not that hyper casual.
I see. I see. Thank you. You mentioned playing in the underground and mentioned playtest during your speech several times. Can you please tell a little more? How do you playtest with the players? Where do you get them? Who are them?
Well, I think that in general, and it's the same answer in hypercasual in general, what the way we play test is actually the core of the testing methods that is now the core of the way every publisher and every developer work in hypercasual. So we run some user acquisition tests, mainly in the US because it remains the biggest audience for our games, and mainly on Facebook because it gives us a good understanding of the appeal, the general appeal of the game. So we run the campaign in the US to get a few players and see how they react in game. And then, as everyone, we analyze the data that we get, so retention, CPI, and all the valuable info that we can have, playtime, of course, to see and judge the potential of one game.
Thank you so much. Okay, compared to a single control, how's the mix and match control affecting retention?
Well, it can be, obviously, it varies a lot from one game to the other, and a bad mix and match game won't be better than a good simple control one. But if you successfully crack the recipe of the mix and match approach, you can get some really impressive numbers, and of course, it directly impacts the results and the retention. So yes,
Mhm.
this is directly correlated.
Thank you so much for the answer. We have one more question. Is depth of control important on CPI level?
Well, the answer it's a good question. The impact is maybe not direct, but you know what the major part of what makes a good CPI is, does this game looks funny to play, and does it looks nice? Do I want to play this game right now? And of course, having a clever gameplay which is deep enough and quite original, well, of course, it makes a huge difference. And if you find, freshness in hypercasual is the key. So if you can create something new and deep, well, in this case, you will probably have the formula to the good CPI and to the good retention, which is what you need to aim if you want to release a hit game, of course.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. If combine different controls, is the game still considered? Uh, oh, sorry, it disappeared. If you combine different controls, is the game still considered as hyper casual?
Well, as long as you do it in a smart and easy to grab way, yes, definitely. For example, Flippy Race that we mentioned in the presentation is definitely hyper casual, and or games like Force Master, for example, from Voodoo. These games are deeply hyper casual because they tick all the boxes. They are super snackable, they are super marketable, and they are, well, the definition of hyper casual games. So yes, as long as you remain careful about how it must remain easy to get. That's the key. Basically, it must remain playable by your grandmother or your little brother, basically. And as long as it's the case, well, it's hyper casual.
I see. Thank you so much. The next question is two-handed play bad for hyper casual? What about offering two ways to control the game?
So the using two hands to play for the same reason than the accelerometer, for example. So for accessibility reason, is usually not something that we want. Again, so a lot of our players are just playing while they're doing something else. So it can be while they're in the subway holding the bar, to not fall. It can be we want them to be able to play in a very casual way without thinking about it too much. So two controls are more traditionally used for deep, more engaging games and more engaging experience. So more, on the casual games where you have, for example, a joystick and a tap to shoot or these kind of things.
Hmm. Thank you so much. I believe many listeners would be more than happy to know how to get this manual you have presented today, how to download it as a video or as slides or whatever. Is it possible?
Sure, it is, and it will be. Do not hesitate to ping me either on Skype or in LinkedIn. You can just click on my profile on the tool of the event, and you will have direct access to my contact, and I will be happy to share it with you. Otherwise, this presentation will be live again in I think 1 or 2 weeks after the event. So yeah, do not hesitate.
Great. This sounds really great. Okay, considering one activity several steps approach, would you consider using different controls for each step complex?
That's a good question. I don't think there's a golden rule here. We've seen successful games with different controls on this side. I think that it remains probably more easy to get for the players if the controls remain quite similar. But we've seen, I think it's totally doable, and there are probably many examples out there of games where the controls completely change from one phase of the game to the other. I think that the point is mainly, again, to make it simple to get and to make sure that each gameplay taken separately is hyper casual by nature, and it shouldn't be any problem.
Thank you. What are the least and the most favorite control in hypercasual?
Well, that's the whole point of this presentation, was to say that there's not a bad or good controller by nature. So apart maybe from the very weird ones, so accelerometer, face control, face tracking controls, there's not a good or bad one. Just you need to take in consideration that each controller has its own depth potential, and that what matters is that this controller is the one that better highlights the experience that you want to offer. If it's all about freedom, if the what must be interesting in your game is about freedom, in that case you probably should go for either joystick or drawing, things that let the player express a bit their creativity. If you want to focus on something that is really satisfying visually speaking, maybe you can go for more binary, where the results of your action matter more than the way you perform it. In this kind of cases, maybe having something more binary like tap timing or tap to hold would make more sense. But in the end, it's all about your game ID and what would work the best to highlight it.
Thank you. The last question for this Q&A session. What about having two ways to control the game?
Well, that's not something that we see a lot. It happens if for example, if for some reason you build a game and you have two ways to play from the start, you A/B test them, and you can't seem to find an especially, like, both are doing great KPI wise and both are interesting to play. Well, in that case, I think it can make sense to keep both and to have one, hidden in the menus that you can activate if you want to. But otherwise, if you want every players to get how to play your game clearly and from the first seconds they use the game, I think it's safer to go for one control, which is deep enough to make the player stay for a long time.
Thank you so much for your answers and especially for this really unique content. Um, let's keep in touch. I believe you'll receive more messages in Pine and chat, so stay tuned.
Thanks a lot. It was great. It was really great to be here today, and I'm looking forward to answering all the questions that you might have, guys, in the comments. See you.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.